Hello guys, this is water? No, this is new, beautiful Reddit story.
Title: The UN monitoring US elections, a deep dive into what it could mean. I remember the first time I saw someone mention the idea of the UN stepping in to monitor US elections. It was on a Reddit thread, buried in a heated discussion about the integrity of the 2020 elections, and the comment was almost a throwaway line. Someone said, "Maybe it's time for the UN to start overseeing US elections." At first, I laughed it off. The idea seemed ludicrous. The United States, the world's self-proclaimed beacon of democracy, needing international oversight? Surely, that wasn't necessary, right? But the more I thought about it, the more the idea lingered in my mind. What would it really mean for the UN to come in and oversee US elections? What would it say about our democracy, and how would it affect the rest of the world's perception of us? Over the years, the notion has shifted from a joke to something that feels less outlandish. So, let's entertain the idea of the UN stepping in and the possible consequences. The background: a crisis of confidence. It's hard to deny that the US has been facing a crisis of confidence in its own electoral system. From questions of voter suppression to the rising influence of money in politics, people have been growing more and more skeptical of the fairness and transparency of the process. The 2000 election, with the Florida recount fiasco, felt like a precursor to what we'd see more and more in future elections. It was a huge wake-up call that not even the most advanced democracy in the world was immune to errors or manipulations. But it wasn't until 2016 that things really started to feel different. The Russia interference scandal hit like a thunderclap, and suddenly, it wasn't just about domestic issues. It was about foreign powers meddling in the very heart of American democracy. And then, of course, there was the 2020 election, which saw a record number of mail-in ballots due to the pandemic. Some claims of voter fraud were made, despite no evidence to support them. The Capitol insurrection that followed only made matters worse. The message that was sent wasn't a good one. The system was fragile, and people were losing trust in it. Enter the UN. What would UN oversight look like? First, we need to understand how the UN operates when it monitors elections. The United Nations has a long history of monitoring elections in emerging democracies or post-conflict regions. Their goal is to ensure that elections are free, fair, transparent, and reflect the will of the people. They send teams of experts, ranging from legal professionals to political analysts to election observers, to scrutinize everything from voter registration to polling station procedures to the integrity of vote counting. Now, imagine that level of scrutiny applied to the United States, a country that prides itself on being the model for democracy. There would be teams deployed to each state, conducting checks to ensure that the voting systems were tamper-proof. They'd be looking at how states handle voter registration, ensuring no one is excluded, and they'd likely scrutinize how different groups are represented in the voting process, whether voters of color, low-income individuals, or others are being disproportionately impacted by local laws. Additionally, the UN would likely work to standardize processes across states to ensure uniformity. Currently, each state in the US can run its elections differently, which is one of the reasons there are so many discrepancies in the voting process. The UN's presence might push for more federal oversight of elections to ensure consistency and accountability. But, honestly, what really struck me was the symbolism of it all. The United States, the nation that has always positioned itself as the leader of the free world, having the UN come in to ensure that its elections were fair, it feels like a slap in the face. It would send a signal that maybe, just maybe, we're not as untouchable as we once thought. The perception problem. Let's talk about how this would play out on the world stage. The United States, for all its flaws, has historically been viewed as the gold standard for democracy. It's a difficult pill to swallow, but it's true. The idea that other countries would look to the US as the beacon of freedom and fairness is something that has been ingrained in the American identity for generations. But the moment the UN steps in, that perception would shatter. The world would start to question how much of a democracy the US really is. Imagine countries like China, Russia, or even Turkey, who already like to point fingers at the US for its flaws, now using the fact that the UN had to intervene as ammunition against us. They'd point to the situation as evidence that the US is no longer a model democracy. And, in a sense, they wouldn't be wrong. For decades, The US has told the world how to conduct elections, pushing for international standards. But now we're asking for help. That would be a tough pill to swallow, both for the international community and for Americans themselves. But it's not just authoritarian countries that would be watching. Allies like the UK, Canada, and Australia would be keeping a close eye on this development. They may not be as vocal, but it would undoubtedly have an impact on their view of the US. Even though these countries share many of the same democratic ideals, they'd wonder why the US needed to be saved by the UN. Would they start questioning the integrity of their own systems? Would they follow suit and ask the UN to monitor their own elections? The ripple effect would be profound. Internal consequences, national identity crisis. The impact on national pride would be one of the hardest things to reconcile. The US has long held the belief that it's a shining example of democratic ideals. Sure, the system has always had its flaws: slavery, disenfranchisement, Jim Crow laws, gerrymandering, and voter suppression, but the narrative has always been that we're working to fix those issues. The idea of the UN stepping in suggests that the US might not be able to fix these problems on its own. It would expose the cracks in the foundation of American democracy in a way that is impossible to ignore. There's also the question of how Americans themselves would react. A large portion of the population, particularly those who feel disenfranchised or have lost trust in the system, might see the UN as a welcome force. They could see it as a neutral entity coming in to restore order and integrity. But for others, particularly those on the political right, this could be seen as a massive affront. There's a long-standing narrative in the US that the government is overreaching and interfering in the lives of citizens, and the idea of the UN coming in might seem like a bridge too far. Many would likely see it as an infringement on American sovereignty, a foreign body meddling in what they view as an internal issue. I'm sure we'd see protests, petitions, and maybe even attempts to block the process. The backlash could lead to an even deeper divide in an already polarized country. Could the US ever recover from that? Would it even matter if it did? What about the positive aspects? Despite all the controversy, there are potential upsides to the UN's involvement. For one, their oversight could help restore faith in the system for many voters. If the UN were involved in monitoring the process, it would bring a level of transparency that might reduce accusations of fraud and corruption. The presence of international observers might help ensure that both sides play by the same rules and could reduce the chances of future legal challenges or contested results. It could also lead to long-term reforms. With the UN in the mix, the US might be forced to rethink its broken electoral system. The Electoral College, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, all of these could come under intense scrutiny. If the UN found systemic flaws in how elections are conducted, it might prompt real change that could improve the system in the long run. There could also be a boost to global democracy. If the US sets a precedent by allowing external oversight, it could encourage other countries with shaky electoral processes to do the same. The idea of a more transparent, globally coordinated election system might take root, making democracy stronger worldwide. The takeaway: would I be okay with the UN overseeing US elections? It's a tough question. On one hand, the idea feels like a loss of national pride, a failure of the system we've always touted as the best in the world. But on the other hand, if it meant that our elections were actually free, fair, and transparent, maybe it's a step we need to take. It's not an easy decision, and it would come with a lot of baggage, both politically and culturally. But in the end, maybe the real question is this: if we want to be the beacon of democracy we claim to be, shouldn't we be willing to prove it, no matter who's watching? To me, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but one that might be necessary to restore faith in the system.